The sky above our capital had turned the color of rust, and I knew in my bones that we were looking at the beginning of the end. I stood on the observation deck of the high chamber, my hands gripping the railing so hard that my knuckles had gone pale beneath my slate-gray skin, and I watched the sun do something that no sun should ever do. It flickered, not like a candle in the wind, like a heartbeat that was losing its rhythm, and the astronomers standing behind me, 5 of the sharpest minds our species had ever produced, could not tell me why. My name is Valen Koth. I am the senior diplomat of the Draven sovereignty, and on that morning, I became the man responsible for telling 900 million people that their world was dying. The chief astronomer, a woman named Sarath Vale, pulled up the latest readings on her display and projected them across the curved wall of the chamber. I did not need to understand every number to read the shape of what she was showing me. The graphs all pointed in one direction. Down. Our star, Aethys, was collapsing from the inside. Something in its core had destabilized, and the process was accelerating in ways that defied every model we had ever built. She told me we had 18 months, maybe less, maybe much less. I asked her if she was certain. She looked at me with eyes that had not slept in days, and said that she wished, more than anything she had ever wished for in her life, that she was wrong. I walked out of that briefing and stood alone on the terrace overlooking the city. Below me, Draven children were walking to their lessons, their small voices rising in fragments of conversation that the wind carried up to me. Market stalls were opening along the central avenue. A transport shuttle hummed overhead, carrying workers to the eastern refineries. 2 elderly men sat on a bench near the fountain, playing a board game they had probably been playing together for decades. None of them knew. None of them could feel what I felt standing up there, looking at that sick, flickering sun, and understanding that everything beneath it had an expiration date stamped across it in invisible ink. The magnetic field was already weakening. We had seen the early signs for months, but attributed them to a natural cycle. Now the crop failures in the southern provinces made sense. The radiation surges that had overwhelmed 3 coastal hospitals made sense. The infrastructure failures, the communication blackouts, the strange electrical storms that rolled across the plains without rain, the power grid fluctuations that engineers had blamed on aging equipment. It all made sense now, and the sense it made was the worst possible kind. I drafted the emergency petition that afternoon. Every word felt like a stone I was placing on a scale, trying to balance desperation against dignity. The Galactic Concord, the coalition of over 400 species that governed interstellar law, had protocols for situations like this. Planetary emergency assistance, evacuation frameworks, resource redistribution in times of existential crisis. I had studied these protocols. I had helped draft some of them decades ago, back when I believed the Concord was what it claimed to be, back when I thought the words on those documents meant what they said. I transmitted the petition on a priority channel and waited. 3 days passed. 3 days of watching that sun flicker while my people went about their lives not knowing. 3 days of fielding calls from provincial governors who were starting to ask increasingly pointed questions about the crop failures, questions I could not yet answer without triggering a panic that would do more harm than the truth. 3 days of sitting in my office with a cold cup of tea, staring at a communication console that remained silent as a stone. On the 4th day, a response arrived. It was 14 words long. Your petition has been received and is currently under review by the appropriate committee. I read those 14 words 6 times. I had spent 40 years in diplomacy. I knew what every phrase meant, what every silence between the words contained. Under review meant buried. Appropriate committee meant no one with the authority to act. The Concord had received our cry for help and filed it in a drawer. And somewhere in the vast machinery of galactic bureaucracy, a clerk had typed those 14 words and moved on to the next item in their queue without a second thought. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes, and the past came flooding in like a tide I had been holding back for decades. 60 years. It had been 60 years since I stood in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Concord, as a young attaché, barely old enough to wear the diplomatic sash, and watched 412 species vote to condemn a world. Earth, a small blue planet in an unremarkable system at the edge of the spiral arm. Its people, humans, had barely achieved interstellar capability when a Concorde survey fleet entered their system unannounced. The humans, frightened and outgunned, and facing ships they had no way to identify as friend or foe, had fired on the fleet. It was a catastrophic misunderstanding, a first-contact disaster born of fear on both sides, the kind of tragedy that a wiser galaxy would have mourned and learned from. But the Concorde did not see it that way. The Concorde saw an aggressive species that had attacked without provocation, and the Assembly voted to quarantine the entire system. Full blockade, no trade, no communication, no aid, no contact of any kind. Earth was to be sealed off from the rest of the galaxy and left to fend for itself, cut off from the technologies and resources that could have lifted its people into the community of civilized worlds. The vote was 412 to 1. We were the one. I remember our ambassador, a tall woman named Calith Drayan, standing at the podium after the vote. The hall was already emptying. Delegates were filing out through the tall doors at the back, talking among themselves about their dinner plans, the matter already settled in their minds. But Calith stood there and spoke anyway. She called it what it was. She said the word that no one wanted to hear. She called it murder. Not the quick kind. Not the kind that leaves blood on your hands and guilt in your nightmares. The slow kind. The patient kind. The kind where you close a door and walk away and pretend you cannot hear what happens on the other side. The kind where you convince yourself that what you cannot see is not your responsibility. No one listened. Some of them laughed. I remember the laughter more clearly than anything else from that day. It was not cruel laughter. It was dismissive. The sound of powerful beings who had already decided that the matter was too small, the species too insignificant, the stakes too low to warrant their attention. But we did not walk away. The Draven sovereignty, a civilization of fewer than 1 billion souls with a modest fleet and an economy that barely registered on the galactic scale, defied the Concorde. We ran the blockade, not once, not twice, 43 times over 12 years. Our ships slipped past Concorde patrol lines and delivered supplies to Earth. Medical equipment that saved millions from a pandemic their doctors had no tools to fight. Water purification systems that turned poisoned rivers clean again. Agricultural seedlings engineered to grow in human soil, designed by our botanists who worked around the clock for months to get the genetics right. Communication technology, so they would know they were not alone, so they could hear a voice from the stars telling them that someone out there cared whether they lived or died. We lost 11 ships. 200 of our people died in those runs. Some were destroyed by Concorde patrol vessels that had standing orders to enforce the blockade by any means necessary. Some were lost to engine failures in the dangerous transit corridors we were forced to use, narrow gaps in the patrol net where the gravitational interference from nearby bodies made navigation a gamble. Every name was recorded. Every family was told. Every loss was a wound in a civilization that could not afford to bleed. And the Concorde punished us for it. Trade embargoes that cut off our access to critical raw materials. Revoked travel privileges that stranded our scholars and students on foreign worlds. Frozen diplomatic assets that crippled our foreign service. Technology sharing agreements canceled. Research partnerships dissolved. Cultural exchanges terminated. One by one, the threads that connected us to the wider galaxy were cut, and we were left holding nothing but the knowledge that we had done what was right. Our economy never recovered, not fully. 60 years later, we were still feeling the effects. Our fleet was smaller than it had been before the sanctions. Our infrastructure was older, maintained past its intended lifespan by engineers who had learned to work miracles with limited resources. Our young people left for Concorde worlds, where the opportunities were greater, where the sanctions did not reach, and most of them did not come back. And now our sun was dying, and the Concorde's response was 14 words of nothing. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling of my office. I was old now. My joints ached in the morning. My vision was not what it had been. My hair had gone silver 2 decades ago, and the face that looked back at me from the mirror each morning belonged to a man who had carried too much for too long. But I remembered everything. I remembered the face of every pilot who flew those blockade runs, the way they looked when they climbed into their ships knowing they might not come back. I remembered the name of every ship we lost. I remembered the day the last supply run returned safely, and the crew wept on the landing pad because they knew it was over. They knew the Concorde would tighten the net until no one could get through again. And the weeping was not for themselves, but for the people on Earth who would not receive the next shipment. I remembered all of it, and I wondered, sitting in that office with the cold tea and the silent console, if it had mattered, if any of it had made a difference. If Earth even remembered what a small, insignificant species on the wrong side of the galaxy had done for them. My aide, a young man named Torin, burst through the door without knocking. His face was flushed and his eyes were wide, and he was holding a data tablet in both hands, like it might shatter if he gripped it wrong. He was breathing hard, as if he had run the entire length of the building to reach me. He told me a transmission had come in, not from the Concorde, not from any known diplomatic channel. It had arrived on an old frequency, one we had not actively monitored in decades, a frequency we had used during the blockade runs to communicate with the surface of Earth. I took the tablet from him, with hands that had gone numb, and played the message. The voice was human. I had not heard a human voice in 40 years, not since the blockade was finally lifted and Earth went quiet. The humans had not rejoined the Concorde. They had not reached out to anyone. They had simply gone silent, and the galaxy had assumed they were still licking their wounds, still struggling, still small and broken and irrelevant. The voice spoke in Draven, broken, accented, imperfect, clearly learned from recordings rather than conversation, but unmistakable. Someone had learned our language. Someone had gone to the trouble of learning the tongue of the one species that had stood for them when the rest of the galaxy turned its back. The message was short, 6 words that changed everything I thought I knew about the universe and my place in it. We are coming. Hold on. I set the tablet down on my desk and stared at it. My hands were trembling so badly that I had to press them flat against the surface to keep them still. Torin was asking me questions, his voice urgent and confused, but I could not hear him over the sound of my own heart hammering against my ribs. I was 60 years in the past and 60 years in the present at the same time, standing in 2 moments that were connected by a thread I had never expected to see pulled taut. I did not know what Earth had become. No one did. They had gone dark, gone silent, gone somewhere beyond the edge of what the Concorde monitored or cared about. For 40 years, they had been a footnote in the galactic record, a closed file, a species that the powerful had written off as irrelevant. But they remembered. Whatever they had become, wherever they had gone, whatever they had built in the silence that the galaxy had imposed on them, they remembered who had stood for them in the dark. And they were coming. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my office with the transmission playing on a loop, listening to that human voice say those 6 words over and over, until they stopped sounding like words, and started sounding like a heartbeat. We are coming. Hold on. We are coming. Hold on. Each repetition drove the reality deeper into my bones, and each time I heard it, a part of me that had been holding its breath for 60 years, exhaled just a little. By morning, the Concorde intelligence agencies had noticed what we had been too stunned to immediately report: anomalies at the edge of mapped space, energy signatures that did not match any known drive configuration, ships, or something like ships, moving in patterns that suggested coordination on a scale the Concorde had never encountered from a single species. The initial reports were dismissive, sensor ghosts probably, stellar phenomena misread by automated systems. Some junior analyst somewhere typed up a reassurance memo, and the matter was considered handled. The Concorde had spent 60 years believing that humans were a minor species, trapped on a single damaged world, and that belief had calcified into certainty, so complete that it had become a kind of blindness. No one considered the possibility that they were wrong, no one except me. I had been wrong about many things in my life, but I had never been wrong about humans. Even 60 years ago, when I was young and frightened and watching my government defy the most powerful coalition in the galaxy for a species we had never met face to face, I had understood something about them that the Concorde never grasped. They survived, not the way most species survived, by adapting to their environment or finding equilibrium with the forces around them. Humans survived by becoming something new. Every crisis, every setback, every force that tried to destroy them became raw material. They took their wounds and built armor from them. They took their scars and turned them into maps. The Concord had locked them in a room and thrown away the key, and now, 40 years later, something was coming out of that room, and it was not the same thing that had gone in. I made my second appeal to the Concord Assembly in person. I traveled to the Central Station, a journey of 3 days that I spent reviewing evacuation models, running calculations, and trying to determine how many of my people we could save with our own resources. The answer was not enough. It was never going to be enough. We had 46 transport vessels capable of interstellar travel, and 900 million people who needed to leave a world that was dying beneath their feet. The mathematics of extinction do not negotiate. They do not bend for good intentions or brave speeches. They are what they are. The assembly chamber was exactly as I remembered it from 60 years ago. The same curved walls, the same tiered seating for 400 delegations, the same polished floor that reflected the overhead lights like still water. I stood at the same podium where Calith Drayan had called the Earth blockade murder, and I felt her standing beside me like a ghost, her hand on my shoulder, her voice in my ear saying, "Tell them the truth, and let them decide what kind of beings they want to be." I presented our case. I showed them the data, the stellar collapse models rendered in three-dimensional projections that filled the chamber with the image of our dying star. The timeline projections that showed 18 months narrowing to 12, to 6, to unknowable. The crop failure maps with entire provinces shaded red. The radiation exposure statistics from hospitals that were running out of treatment capacity. I showed them images of Draven children playing in streets that would be uninhabitable within a year. I kept my voice steady. I did not beg. Calith had taught me that, though she had been dead for 11 years and would never know how well I had learned her lessons. You do not beg the powerful for mercy. You present the truth and let them decide what kind of beings they want to be. The delegates expressed sympathy. Several of them used that exact word, as if they had agreed upon it in advance. Sympathy. Such a small word for such a large failure. They cited resource constraints, jurisdictional complications, logistical challenges that would require further study. The process of deliberation itself became a weapon, each delay buying another day, in which nothing happened, and 900 million people moved one day closer to the end. One delegate, from a species whose name I will not honor by repeating, suggested from his cushioned seat that the Draven should have invested more heavily in colony development rather than spending resources on what he called unauthorized humanitarian adventures. He meant the blockade runs. He meant the ships we sent to Earth. He was telling me to my face, in front of 400 delegations, that my people deserved to die because we had once tried to save someone else from dying. I left the chamber without responding. There was nothing to say that the walls of that room had not already heard and ignored. In the corridor outside, a senior Concord delegate, a Thessian, named Orvek Mal, intercepted me. He was old, older than me, with the weathered look of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating the currents of power without ever once being moved by them. He fell into step beside me and spoke with the casual cruelty of someone who had wielded authority for so long that he had forgotten it was supposed to come with responsibility. He leaned close and said something I will never forget as long as I draw breath. He said, "You chose your allies 60 years ago, Valen. Perhaps they can help you now." He meant it as mockery. He meant it as the final twist of a knife that had been buried in our side for 6 decades. He patted my arm, as if we were old friends sharing a private joke, and walked away smiling, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the unhurried pace of a man who had never had to run from anything in his life. I stood in that corridor and felt something shift inside me. Not despair. I was past despair. Something harder than despair. Something with edges sharp enough to cut. When I returned to the Draven homeworld, Torin was waiting on the landing pad. He was not alone. Behind him stood a cluster of military officers and communication technicians, and all of them were staring upward at a sky that had changed in the 3 days I had been gone. Our deep space monitoring array had detected organized fleet movement, not Concord vessels. The drive signatures were unlike anything in our database. They registered as something between conventional faster-than-light engines and theoretical fold space technology, a hybrid that our physicists said should not exist. The energy output was enormous, Each individual signature burned brighter on our sensors than a Concorde battlecruiser at full power. These were not small ships. There were hundreds of contacts. As I stood on the landing pad reading the display that Torin held up for me, the number updated. Then it updated again. Then again. Thousands. Torin looked at me with eyes that held equal measures of fear and something else. Something that might have been hope, if it had been brave enough to call itself by that name, and asked what we should do. I told him we should do exactly what the humans had asked. We should hold on. The first ship arrived 3 hours later. It dropped out of faster-than-light travel above our homeworld, with a flash of light that was visible from the surface, a brief blue-white flare against the rust-colored sky that made people stop in the streets, stop in the markets, stop in the middle of conversations and arguments and lullabies, and look up. I was on the observation deck of the high chamber when it appeared on our screens, and for a moment, that seemed to stretch across the entire width of my life. I forgot to breathe. It was enormous. Larger than any Concorde dreadnought I had ever seen, and I had seen many in my decades of diplomatic travel. But its design was nothing like the angular, utilitarian warships the Concorde favored. This vessel had curves, organic shapes that flowed into each other like the architecture of a living thing, like something that had grown rather than been built. The hull plating shifted and rippled as I watched, adapting to the radiation environment in real time, changing color and texture, with a fluidity that suggested the ship itself was aware of its surroundings. And through transparent sections along the vessel's midsection, I could see green, gardens, forests even. Living ecosystems contained within a ship that had crossed the stars. It did not look like a warship, it looked like a city that had learned to fly. A communication request came through on our diplomatic channel. I accepted it with hands that had not stopped trembling since the transmission the night before. The face that appeared on my screen was human. A woman with dark skin and close-cropped hair, and deep brown eyes that held a warmth I was not prepared for. She wore a uniform I did not recognize, dark blue with silver threading at the collar. She smiled when she saw me, and the smile reached her eyes in a way that told me it was not diplomatic courtesy. It was personal. She had been waiting for this moment. She introduced herself as Lena Osei, Ambassador of Debts for the Terran Compact. I asked her to repeat the title because I was certain I had misheard. She did, and then she explained it. Humanity, she told me, keeps a ledger. Not a ledger of grievances, not a record of wrongs done to them, not a tally of enemies to be settled with, a ledger of kindnesses. Every act of compassion shown to humanity during its darkest hours is recorded, remembered, and held in trust until it can be repaid. The position of Ambassador of Debts was created specifically to manage that ledger, to ensure that no kindness is ever forgotten, no grace is ever lost, and no debt is ever left unsettled. The Draven, she said, are the first entry. I could not speak for a long moment. The words sat in the air between us, heavy and luminous, and I felt the weight of 60 years pressing against my chest in a way that was no longer painful, but was almost unbearable in its sweetness. Lena waited. She did not fill the silence with words. She did not prompt me or redirect. She let it sit there between us, and she held my gaze with the patience of someone who understood what she had just given me. When I found my voice, I asked her what had happened to Earth. What had happened to the species we had risked everything to save 60 years ago? She told me, and what she told me rewrote everything I thought I knew about the galaxy I lived in. After the blockade was lifted, humanity did not rejoin the Concorde. They did not petition for membership. They did not send delegations, or request trade agreements, or grovel for readmission to the community that had tried to kill them through neglect. They turned their backs on all of it. They went the other direction, outward. Into the unmapped territories beyond Concorde space, the vast reaches where no one was watching, no one was governing, and no one was telling them what they could or could not become. They colonized, they innovated, they built. In the darkness and silence of exile, they created a civilization from scratch. The Terran Compact now spanned over 200 worlds. They had developed technologies that the Concorde had not imagined, not because humans were inherently smarter than other species, but because they had been forced to solve problems that no one else had ever faced. When you cannot trade for what you need, you invent it. When you cannot rely on others, You become reliant on your own ingenuity. Isolation had made them creative. Adversity had made them relentless. And the memory of what had been done to them, and what had been done for them, had made them something the galaxy had never seen before. They had been watching our situation for months, monitoring our sun from long-range observatories, tracking the collapse, running their own models alongside our publicly available data. And when they confirmed what we feared, they did not deliberate. They did not form committees. They did not discuss jurisdictional complications or resource constraints. They began preparing. Lena laid out the plan with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed it 100 times. Full planetary evacuation. Every single Draven, 900 million souls, down to the last child, the last elder, the last person who could not walk and would need to be carried. Every cultural artifact, every library, every seed bank, every monument, every religious site, every grave marker that could be moved. Nothing left behind, nothing forgotten, nothing deemed too small, or too old, or too insignificant to save. They had identified 3 candidate worlds in Terran space, already terraformed, already prepared, already waiting for us, with infrastructure and agriculture and housing and schools and hospitals standing empty and ready, built by human hands for Draven lives. I asked her why. I asked her even though I already knew the answer, even though it was written in the curve of her smile and the steadiness of her voice, and the fact that she had learned to speak our language. I needed to hear her say it. I needed a human voice to speak the words aloud. She said it simply, because you came for us when no one else would. I closed my eyes and let 60 years of weight lift off my shoulders so suddenly that I felt dizzy with the absence of it. And then I opened them again, because Torin was at my side, speaking rapidly, his voice tight with a new kind of urgency. The Concord had dispatched a diplomatic fleet to the Draven system, 60 warships under the banner of humanitarian observation, not coming to help us, coming to watch, and to make absolutely certain that whatever was happening between the Draven and the humans did not upset the balance of power that the Concord had spent centuries constructing and defending. The Concord did not want to save us, but they did not want the humans to save us either. Because a humanity that could save entire civilizations was a humanity that the Concord could no longer afford to ignore. And a Concord that had been shown up by a species it once condemned was a Concord whose authority might never recover. Lena Osei heard the report through the still-open communication channel. Her expression did not change. Not a flicker of surprise, not a moment of concern. She looked at me with calm, steady eyes, and she said 4 words that carried the weight of a civilization that had learned to be strong in the dark. She said we expected this. The Concord fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel, in a formation that was designed to intimidate. 60 warships arranged in a crescent, weapons ports visible, shield generators humming at standby levels, every ship positioned to project maximum threat. Their commander, an admiral named Torek Sin, transmitted a warning on an open channel before his ships had even finished their deceleration burn. He declared that any unauthorized evacuation of a Concord member species constituted a sovereignty violation under Section 47 of the Interstellar Governance Compact. He demanded that all non-Concord vessels identify themselves, submit to inspection, and prepare to receive a boarding delegation. The humans did not respond. They did not acknowledge the transmission. They did not power up weapons or raise shields. They did not alter course or adjust formation, or show any indication that they had heard the most powerful military force in the galaxy threatening them with enforcement action. They simply kept working, as if 60 warships had not just appeared in their operational space, as if the Concord fleet was a passing cloud rather than a loaded weapon. And the work they were doing was beyond anything I had ever witnessed. In the hours since Lena Osei's arrival, the system had filled with human vessels, not warships. Arcs, massive biovessels with living hulls that breathed and rippled and adapted to their environment in real time. Their atmospheric systems made them self-sustaining ecosystems. Each one was large enough to carry millions of passengers in conditions that were not merely survivable, but comfortable, with gardens and common spaces and medical facilities and schools. They moved with a coordination that spoke of months of careful planning, each vessel slotting into position around our world, like pieces of a puzzle that had been designed long before we knew the picture was being assembled. Ground teams deployed within the first day. I went down to the surface to see them work, and what I witnessed redefined my understanding of what technology could accomplish and what compassion looked like when it had resources behind it. A human engineering team set up gravity anchors around a district of the capital where buildings had begun to crack and lean from the seismic instability. The anchors were small devices, no larger than a storage crate, but when activated, they projected a stabilization field that held the structures in place as if invisible hands were pressing them gently back into alignment. Buildings that our engineers had condemned and scheduled for controlled demolition were suddenly safe again. Families who had been evacuated from their homes walked back inside, ran their hands along the walls as if greeting old friends, and wept with a relief that went beyond words. In the southern provinces, where the radiation surges had devastated agriculture and left the soil poisoned, human teams deployed atmospheric scrubbers that cleaned the air faster than our best instruments could measure. They set up medical stations with equipment I had never encountered in any Concord facility, pods that could diagnose and treat conditions that our doctors had declared terminal. I stood beside one of those pods and watched a Draven woman who had been told she had 6 months to live walk out on steady legs and get told by a human medic that she had 60 years ahead of her. She collapsed into the medic's arms and held on as if the human were the only solid thing in a world that had turned to water. But it was the cultural preservation that broke me. I stood in the plaza outside the Temple of First Dawn, the oldest structure in our capital. 3,000 years of continuous worship. 3,000 years of hands touching its walls, of feet wearing smooth grooves in its steps, of voices rising toward its vaulted ceiling in song. The building had begun to crumble as the ground beneath it shifted. Cracks ran through walls that had been carved with the histories of our earliest ancestors. The dome was listing to one side. Our Preservation Society had declared the loss inevitable and asked people to take photographs while they still could. A team of 20 human engineers surrounded the temple. They worked with tools that seemed to read the building's structure the way a doctor reads a patient. Scanning, mapping, measuring with a precision that bordered on tenderness. They identified every stress point, cataloged every carved surface, recorded every imperfection and wear pattern with a thoroughness that suggested they understood what they were looking at. Not just stone, memory. In 6 hours, they disassembled the entire temple. Every piece was tagged, scanned, holographically recorded, and loaded into a preservation container that maintained the exact atmospheric conditions the materials required. They saved the building, but more than that, they saved the history embedded in every surface. The wear patterns on the steps where 100 generations of my people had walked. The discoloration on the walls where hands had touched the stone in prayer, leaving oil and warmth and devotion behind in molecular traces. The faint smell of incense that had seeped into the rock over millennia. They saved all of it. I watched them work, and I thought about what Orvek Mal had said to me in that Concord corridor. You chose your allies 60 years ago. Perhaps they can help you now. He had meant it as a cruel joke, a parting cruelty from a man who had never risked anything for anyone. He had no idea how right he was. But not all of my people shared my faith in the humans. Generations had grown up hearing about Earth through the lens of Concord propaganda. The violent species, the aggressive primitives, who had attacked a peaceful survey fleet without provocation or warning. The story had been told and retold, and embellished and hardened, until it had become truth, in the minds of people who had never met a human, never spoken to one, never looked into their eyes, and seen what I saw when I looked into the eyes of Lena Osei. Some of my people refused to board the arcs. In the eastern districts of the capital, entire communities barricaded their streets and declared that they would not submit to alien relocation. In the mountain provinces, religious leaders preached that the dying sun was a test of faith sent by the ancestors, and that leaving the homeworld was a betrayal of everything our civilization had built. In the coastal cities, political factions accused my government of selling our sovereignty to an alien power, of trading one form of subjugation for another. I went to them, not as a diplomat in a pressed uniform, not as a politician with talking points and carefully constructed arguments. I went as an old man who had been alive long enough to know the truth and tired enough to stop being careful with it. I went district by district, city by city, community by community. I stood in town squares and temple courtyards and market plazas and fishing docks and schoolyards, and I told the story, the real story. What we had done for Earth, what it had cost us, what the Concord had done to punish us for our compassion, and why they were doing it again now, what the humans were doing for us in return and why. I told them about the 11 ships we lost. I said the names of those ships out loud, one by one, and I watched people's faces change as they recognized names they had heard as children, names that had become legends and then faded into history. I told them about the 200 Draven who died running the blockade, so that a species on the other side of the galaxy could survive. I told them about Calith Draven, standing alone in that assembly hall, speaking to an empty room, calling the blockade what it was, while 400 species walked away. I told the story so many times that my voice gave out. My throat burned, and my words came out in rasps that I had to force through vocal cords that had stopped cooperating hours ago. But I kept telling it. I whispered it to crowds of hundreds who leaned in close, pressing forward in the silence, straining to hear the ragged voice of an old man who would not stop speaking. Not all of them were convinced. Fear is a deep-rooted thing, and propaganda sown over decades does not wash away in a single afternoon. But enough of them believed. Enough to start moving toward the Arcs. Enough to take the hands of the human ground crews, who helped them carry their belongings, and their children, and their sacred objects, into the ships that would carry them to a sky they had never seen. While I was spending my voice on the truth, the Concord was doing what it did best, applying pressure with a gloved hand. Admiral Torek Sin requested a formal meeting aboard his flagship. I went because refusing would have given him a diplomatic pretext I could not afford to provide. His ship was cold and angular, all metal surfaces and sharp edges and corridors designed to make visitors feel small, the opposite of the human vessels with their curves and gardens and walls that breathed. Torek Sin was a tall, gaunt creature, with scales the color of tarnished silver and eyes that never blinked. He sat across from me in a conference room that was clearly built to intimidate, with high ceilings and a single harsh light that threw shadows across the table, and he laid out his offer with the precision of a surgeon cutting away options. The Concord, he said, was prepared to provide full emergency assistance to the Draven sovereignty, evacuation support with Concord vessels, temporary housing on Concord-administered worlds, resource allocation for long-term resettlement, medical care and infrastructure support, all of it available immediately, without delay, pending the acceptance of certain conditions. The conditions were what I expected: political integration into the Concord administrative structure, military cooperation agreements that would place our remaining fleet under Concord command authority, economic oversight by Concord financial regulators who would control our budgets and trade agreements, permanent observer status, which was a diplomatic term for supervised existence with no voting power and no sovereignty. The Draven would survive, but we would survive as subjects. Our independence would become a historical footnote, and we would exist at the pleasure of the same institution that had voted to abandon Earth and was now watching our sun die without offering so much as a glass of water. Torek Sin presented this as the responsible choice, the rational choice. He spoke about it the way one might discuss a corporate merger, all projections and operational efficiencies and mutual benefit calculations, as if the annihilation of a 10,000-year-old civilization's sovereignty was simply a matter of adjusting the organizational chart. I listened to every word. I asked clarifying questions. I requested that the terms be provided in writing for review by my government. I maintained the posture and tone of a diplomat engaged in serious negotiation, and then I stood up, looked Torek Sin in his unblinking eyes, and told him that I would present his generous offer to my government for consideration. I walked out of that conference room knowing that I would rather watch my sun explode than sign away everything my people had spent 10,000 years building. The Concord did not take implied rejection gracefully. Torek Sin broadcast a warning on an open channel. All non-Concord vessels in the Draven system were ordered to withdraw within 72 hours or face enforcement action. The word enforcement was chosen with surgical precision. It was not a declaration of war. It was something worse. It was a threat wrapped in legal language. The kind of threat that allowed the Concorde to claim it was following proper procedure, even as it aimed weapons at ships whose only purpose was saving lives. For 48 hours, nothing happened. The human arcs continued loading passengers. The engineering teams continued preserving artifacts and stabilizing infrastructure. The medical stations continued healing people who had been given up for dead. The humans worked as if the Concorde fleet was not there, as if 60 warships pointing weapons at them were nothing more than clouds passing overhead. Then Torek Sin transmitted his final warning. All human vessels had 12 hours to begin withdrawal, or they would be fired upon. Lena Osei responded. She had been silent for 2 days. No communications, no diplomatic overtures, no acknowledgement of the Concorde's presence. When she finally spoke, she did it on an open channel, a broadcast so wide that every ship, station, relay, and receiver within 4 systems would pick it up. The entire sector heard what she said next. She began by reading something. It took me a moment to recognize what it was, and when I did, the breath left my body so suddenly that I had to grip the console to stay upright. She was reading Kalith Dran's speech, the speech our ambassador had given 60 years ago after the vote to blockade Earth. The speech about murder by neglect, the speech about closing doors and walking away, and pretending you cannot hear. The speech that no one had listened to, that had been delivered to an emptying hall while 400 delegations filed out through the tall doors at the back of the chamber. Lena read it word for word, every sentence exactly as Kalith had spoken it, with every pause and every inflection placed precisely where our ambassador had placed them 60 years ago. A human woman, standing on the bridge of a ship that should not exist, reading the words of a Draven diplomat who had died, believing that no one had heard her. When Lena finished reading, there was silence on every channel. Then she spoke in her own voice, steady and clear, and she said we were listening. We have always been listening. The Concorde fleet did not fire. Torek Sin did not respond. For the first time in its long and comfortable history, the Concorde had been made to stand in the silence it had created 60 years ago, and it did not know what to do with that silence, because it had never imagined that silence could be returned to them. While the standoff held, Aethys made the decision for all of us. The star lurched. There is no other word for what I saw. A massive coronal event erupted from the surface, sending a wave of radiation across the inner system that lit up every sensor on every ship in a blinding cascade of warnings. Emergency alarms screamed across every frequency. The Concorde fleet immediately pulled back to a safe distance, their ships turning and running for the outer system with an urgency that put the lie to every word Torek Sin had spoken about humanitarian concern. The human ships did not run. The arcs repositioned. They moved between the radiation wave and our world, forming a living barrier, and something in their hulls activated. Energy dispersal technology, Lena called it later. The living hulls of the human ships absorbed the radiation, channeling it through their biological and mechanical systems, and dissipating it in controlled bursts that turned deadly energy into harmless light. The arcs shuddered. I could see it on the monitoring screens, the hulls rippling and straining. The ships were in distress, but they held. They held because the people inside them and the people commanding them refused to move. The timeline collapsed. Months became weeks. The next eruption could come at any time, and the next one would be worse. The evacuation pace doubled, then tripled. I watched human crews work without sleep. 18-hour shifts became 24-hour shifts, became something beyond measurement. People working until their bodies failed, and they had to be carried to medical bays by their own comrades, and replacements stepped in without missing a single beat. Not a heartbeat of hesitation, not a word of complaint. A human engineer named Daniel Harding, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and hands that never stopped moving, was working on the preservation of a school building when a structural beam gave way above him. 3 Draven workers froze. Daniel did not. He threw himself under the beam and held it long enough for the others to clear the area. When they pulled him out, his shoulder was dislocated, and his face was covered in dust and blood, and the first thing he asked, before he asked about himself, was whether the children's artwork on the classroom walls had been saved. And then we reached the crisis that nearly ended everything. The Vault of First Songs, our most sacred site. the cultural foundation of our entire civilization, containing recordings and artifacts that predated our written history. It was located deep beneath the capital, carved into the bedrock, protected by layers of stone and reinforced architecture that had been designed to endure forever. Seismic instability had compromised the access tunnels. Our engineers declared the vault unreachable and recommended accepting the loss. The human engineering team proposed a plan so dangerous that their own safety officers formally objected. The probability of success was 31%. Sophie Grant, the chief structural analyst, called it somewhere between extremely inadvisable and genuinely insane. They were going to do it anyway, and I insisted on going with them. We descended into the dark. The walls groaned with every step. The gravity anchors held open a space that the earth wanted to close. We reached the vault. We found the first songs, hundreds of crystalline recording matrices containing the voices of our ancestors. And in the far corner, behind a partition so old the stone had grown around it, we found something else, a star chart, ancient beyond comprehension, carved into stone with tools that matched no known Draven technology. It showed a route between two systems. One was ours. The other contained a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. Earth. The ground shook. Sophie's voice came through the communicator, with an edge that cut through the noise. The tunnel was collapsing. We loaded the chart into the last transport case. Daniel shouldered it himself. And we ran. We came out of that tunnel like people being born, gasping and stumbling into the light, as the passage collapsed behind us with a sound like the world folding in on itself. The dust cloud that followed us out was so thick that I could not see my own hands for several heartbeats. When it cleared, I was on my knees on the cracked pavement of the Temple Plaza, and Daniel Harding was beside me, the transport case still cradled against his chest, and Sophie Grant was standing at the ruined tunnel entrance, with tears cutting clean tracks through the dust caked on her face. We had everything. The first songs, the star chart, every crystal, every artifact, every piece of a past that stretched back further than memory. But there was no time to process what we had found beneath the capital. The surface had transformed while we were underground. Aethys had emitted a second pulse during our descent, larger than the first, carrying enough radiation to overwhelm the atmospheric scrubbers the humans had deployed across the southern districts. The capital's power grid had failed across 6 districts. Emergency lighting painted the streets in amber and shadow, turning familiar buildings into strange silhouettes. The constant hum of evacuation shuttles filled the air, a sound so dense and persistent it had become a new form of silence. Everywhere I looked, Draven families were moving toward the landing zones, carrying children on their hips and bundles of possessions on their backs, and the small sacred objects that every household kept near the door, for exactly this kind of moment. The moment you had always feared. The moment when you leave and do not come back. I sat in a medical tent while a human medic named Nadia Cole checked me for radiation exposure and treated a gash on my forearm that I had not noticed until she pointed it out. She was young, no more than 30, with steady hands and a voice that radiated calm the way the human arcs radiated light. She told me I was fine. She told me I was tougher than I looked, and she said it with a grin that made me believe her. She handed me an extra water canister for the road and told me to drink all of it, and when I said I could not rest, she nodded, as if she had heard that answer from every person she had treated that day. The star chart consumed my thoughts, even as the world crumbled around me. I kept returning to it, tracing the implications like following a river upstream to a source hidden in mountains no one had climbed. The Draven and humans were connected, not by politics, not by the accident of a blockade run, not by the choices of diplomats and pilots, by something older, something buried so deep in our collective history that we had forgotten it existed. The songs I had grown up hearing, the oldest songs in our tradition, the ones that predated our written language and were passed down through oral tradition across hundreds of generations, were full of images I had never understood: a blue silence, a distant garden, waters that reflected a single pale moon. I had always assumed these were metaphors, the poetic language of ancestors who saw the world through a lens we could no longer share. But they were not metaphors, they were memories. Memories of Earth, encoded in melody and rhythm, and handed down through so many generations that the origin had dissolved but the images remained, vivid and precise, and waiting to be recognized. The Draven did not save Earth because we were more compassionate than other species. We saved Earth because something in us recognized it, something deeper than reason, deeper than politics, deeper than the calculations of cost and benefit that governed the Concord's every decision. We stood for Earth because standing for Earth felt like standing for family. A family we had forgotten we had. And now that family had come home. I emerged from the medical tent into a city living its final hours. The outer districts were already empty, buildings standing hollow and silent, with doors left open, windows reflecting a sun that no longer looked like the sun I had grown up under. Athos had taken on a swollen, angry appearance, its surface roiling with activity visible to the naked eye. It looked feverish. It looked like something fighting a battle it could not win. The Concorde fleet had retreated to the outer system after the second pulse, their ships maintaining a safe distance while their sensors recorded everything. I looked up and saw one of their observation drones hovering above the capital, its lens tracking a Draven family as they ran toward an evacuation shuttle. A mother carrying an infant pressed against her chest, a father pulling a young child by the hand, the child stumbling every few steps and being lifted and carried and set down again. An elderly woman, moving as fast as her legs would carry her, clutching a wrapped bundle that probably contained the only objects she could save from a lifetime of accumulation. The drone watched them, recorded them, documented their desperation in high resolution from a comfortable altitude, did nothing. I felt something I had not felt in decades. Rage. Clean, bright, clarifying rage. The kind that does not cloud your thinking but sharpens it to a point. The kind that turns despair into purpose. I went to the communications center and opened a channel to the Concorde fleet. Torek Sin answered with his usual expression of cold disinterest. I looked at his narrow, unblinking face on the screen, and I told him that the Draven sovereignty formally withdrew from the Galactic Concorde, effective immediately. We were no longer a member species. We no longer recognized Concorde authority over our system, our people, our decisions, or our future. We were done. Torek Sin told me, in a tone that suggested he was explaining arithmetic to a child, that formal withdrawal required a 90-day review process and approval by a standing committee. I told him he was welcome to review it from the safe distance he had already chosen. Within the Concorde fleet itself, something extraordinary was happening, something that Torek Sin could not control because he had never imagined it was possible. Several species captains were breaking ranks. A Valesi cruiser separated from the formation and moved toward the inner system, broadcasting on an open channel that it was offering independent humanitarian assistance to the Draven people. A Cathani medical frigate broke formation and followed. Then a Paladri cargo hauler with empty holds it was volunteering for refugee transport. Torek Sin ordered them to stand down. 3 captains responded by transmitting their resignations on open channels. The Valesi commander, a woman named Theska Wren, broadcast a statement that was heard across 4 systems. She said that she would not watch another species die while she had engines and empty holds. She said there was a word for what the Concorde was doing, and the word was the same one that a Draven ambassador had spoken 60 years ago in an empty hall. The Concorde's authority did not collapse, but it cracked, visibly and irreparably. And in the space between those cracks, something new began to grow. The final evacuation waves were the hardest, the last cities, the last districts, the places where the holdouts had waited longest, and the fear ran deepest. I went to every one of them with what remained of my voice, and said the same thing. We are not losing our world, we are carrying it with us. Every song we remember, every story we tell, every word of our language and every gesture of our traditions. The world is not the ground beneath our feet. The world is us. I saw things during those final days that I will carry until the last breath leaves my body. A human soldier named Marcus Bell, carrying a Draven elder on his back through a collapsed corridor, moving with such gentle care that you would have thought the elder was made of the most precious substance in the universe. A Draven child, no more than 6 years old, pressing a small carved stone into the hands of a human shuttle pilot named Claire Dunbar. It was a trust stone, a gift given to someone you are placing your life in the care of, one of the oldest traditions in our culture. Claire took the stone in both hands, and knelt down so she was at the child's eye level. She whispered something I could not hear. The child smiled and climbed into the shuttle without looking back. Two species that barely knew each other, bound not by treaty, not by alliance, not by political calculation, bound by recognition. One small civilization saying to another across the emptiness, "You matter." The last ships loaded, 900 million Draven, every single one accounted for. The cultural vaults were sealed. The seed banks were aboard. The first songs in the ancient star chart were secured in preservation chambers. I was on the last shuttle. Daniel Harding walked me to the boarding ramp. His shoulder still wrapped in a compression bandage he refused to let anyone properly treat until every civilian was aboard. I turned to look at him, this human with dust in his hair and dried blood on his temple, and exhaustion carved into every line of his face, and I said the only words that fit. In the Draven language, there is an expression that translates roughly as the one who holds the door while the house burns. It is our highest form of respect. I said it to him. He did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. He nodded once and stepped back, and the ramp closed between us. The shuttle lifted off. Through the viewport, I watched my world fall away. The mountains I had hiked as a child, the silver rivers that wound through the Central Valley, the cities built over 10,000 years, layer upon layer, each generation adding to the work of the last. All of it shrinking, becoming small, becoming distant, becoming memory. I pressed my hand against the viewport and whispered goodbye. And then I saw something that stopped everything. My breath, my thoughts, the slow turning of grief in my chest. The human fleet was not leaving. A cluster of ships, science vessels bristling with unfamiliar equipment, was breaking formation and moving toward Ethos, not away from the dying star, toward it. Lena Osi's voice came through the shuttle's communication system, calm and clear, carrying something I had not heard in her voice before, something that sounded almost like joy. She said, "We have one more thing to try." I stood on the observation deck of a human ark named the Remembrance, and watched through a viewport that stretched from floor to ceiling as 16 Terran science vessels took up positions around our dying sun. They moved in a precise geometric pattern, spacing themselves at equal intervals, and as each ship reached its designated coordinates, it began launching objects from its cargo bays. Hundreds of them, small devices that tumbled through the void and then stopped, each one finding its position and holding it with a precision that suggested they were listening to each other, coordinating, aligning. They activated. Each device projected a beam of energy toward its neighbors. The beams connected, crossed, interlocked. A web formed around Aethys, a lattice of shimmering energy that wrapped around the star like a net cast over a thrashing animal. The web was vast. It covered the entire surface of the star, pulsing with light, tightening and adjusting with every convulsion of the stellar surface beneath it. Lena Ose stood beside me. She had not left the observation deck since the deployment began. Her eyes were fixed on the star, and her hands were clasped behind her back, and she was perfectly still, except for a slight tension in her jaw that told me she was not nearly as calm as she appeared. She told me they had been developing stellar stabilization technology for 30 years. It was theoretical work, born in laboratories and refined in simulations, tested on small scales using artificial gravity wells and controlled plasma fields. Every model suggested it could work. But models were not reality, and no one had ever tried to stabilize a star. Not at this scale. Not under these conditions. Not with an entire species watching from the windows of the arks that held everything they had left. She told me they had never had a reason to use this technology before. 30 years of development with no application. A solution looking for a problem. And then, the Draven sun started dying, and the problem found the solution, and the humans did not hesitate. The energy requirements were staggering. Every ship in the Terran fleet diverted power to the stabilization array. The arcs went dark one by one, their lights dimming, their living hulls going still and quiet as every joule of energy was rerouted to the lattice around Aethys. For hours, we existed in darkness and near silence, 900 million Draven sitting in ships that had gone as quiet as held breath, watching through viewports as the web around our star began to glow with an intensity that hurt to look at directly. The star fought back. Aethys writhed against the lattice. Coronal ejections lashed outward like the arms of a drowning creature, crashing against the web with forces that sent shockwaves rippling through the array. The science vessels strained to maintain position, their engines flaring white-hot, as they compensated for gravitational distortions that would have torn any Concorde ship to pieces. I watched one vessel slide dangerously close to the chromosphere before its pilot corrected, pulling the ship back to its position with a maneuver that must have pushed the crew to the edge of consciousness. Hours passed. The deck beneath my feet vibrated with a deep, subsonic frequency that I felt in my bones and teeth and the base of my skull. Lena did not move. Her eyes never left the star. Around us, human crew members monitored readouts and exchanged data in clipped, efficient phrases. No panic, no raised voices, just people doing a thing that had never been done, trusting their work, and their technology, and each other, and the 30 years of preparation that had brought them to this impossible moment. I asked Lena, during a brief lull between stellar convulsions, what would happen if it failed. She looked at me for the first time since the operation began, and I saw the strain in her face, the weight she was carrying behind that composed exterior. She told me then, we take everyone home with us. She said it the way one might say, then we take the next step. As if the complete evacuation and resettlement of an entire species was simply the next line on a list. As if failure was not an ending but a different kind of beginning. That was when something crystallized in my understanding of humans that I had been circling for 60 years without ever quite grasping. They were not brave because they lacked fear. They were brave because they had made a foundational decision, embedded somewhere deep in the architecture of their civilization, that fear was never a reason to stop. Fear was information. It told you what was at stake. And for humans, what was at stake was always worth the risk. Always. The turning point came in the 7th hour. I was sitting on the floor of the observation deck, my back against the viewport, exhausted beyond anything I had ever experienced, when the vibration beneath me changed. It did not stop. It shifted. The frequency dropped. The jagged, arrhythmic pulsing smoothed into something steadier, something that felt less like a battle and more like a settling. I looked up at Lena's face, and the sight of it told me everything before my mind could process the data. She was smiling, not the diplomatic smile she had worn during our first meeting, not the controlled expression of a professional managing a crisis. A real smile, the kind that breaks across a face from somewhere deeper than thought, the kind that once when something you feared was impossible proves itself real. Aethys was stabilizing. The web was working. The collapse was slowing. The chaotic convulsions were dampening into something more regular, more predictable, more manageable. The star was still wounded, still damaged, still far from the healthy yellow furnace it had been a year ago, but it was no longer dying, not today. The science teams delivered their analysis 2 hours later. They could not fully reverse the collapse. The damage to the stellar core was too extensive for any technology to undo entirely, but they could slow it. Not by months, not by years, by centuries. Aethys would burn for 500 years at minimum, probably longer, before the collapse process resumed its terminal acceleration. 500 years for someone to find a permanent solution. 500 years of life for a world that had been given months. The Draven homeworld was scarred, irradiated in places, its ecosystems disrupted, its infrastructure damaged, its surface marked by the violence of a star that had tried to end everything beneath it. But it was not lost. It could be healed. It could be restored. And someday, when the scars had faded and the soil had recovered, and the sky had turned from rust back to the deep amber gold I remembered from my childhood, it could be returned to. The galaxy's reaction arrived at the speed of light and struck with the force of a revelation. The Concorde assembly erupted. Delegations that had sat in cushioned silence while the Draven faced extinction were suddenly scrambling to issue statements, to redefine their positions, to explain why their inaction should not be interpreted as indifference. Species that had done nothing were forced to confront what had happened while they watched. A civilization they had abandoned had been saved by another civilization they had once tried to destroy through neglect. The moral architecture of the galaxy had shifted beneath their feet, and no amount of procedural language could disguise the sound it made. The Velesi commander, Theska Ren, who had broken ranks to offer help, became a symbol that spread across communication networks faster than any official statement. Her words were quoted and repeated on thousands of worlds. Other species began asking the question that the Concord had spent 60 years suppressing and that could no longer be contained. What else did we get wrong? 3 species formally withdrew from the Concord within the month. 7 more demanded structural reforms that would strip the assembly of its power to blockade and abandon. A coalition of smaller civilizations, species that had always been outvoted and overlooked, formed an independent alliance and opened diplomatic relations with the Terran Compact. The old order did not collapse overnight. Institutions that powerful and that entrenched never do. But the cracks were deep, and they were spreading, and everyone who looked at them knew they were irreversible. The Draven settled on the second of the 3 worlds the humans had prepared, chosen because its geological profile most closely matched our homeworld. When I first saw it from orbit through the viewport of the Remembrance, I pressed my hand against the glass, and my vision blurred, and I could not speak for a long time. It was beautiful, purple skies that shifted to deep violet at sunset, and then to black studded with unfamiliar constellations. Mineral-rich soil that our agronomists confirmed would support our native crops with minimal modification. Twin moons that hung in the sky like a pair of watchful eyes, casting double shadows across the landscape. Mountain ranges that reminded me of home without being home, which was somehow exactly right. Not a replacement, a continuation. The humans had named it. Lena told me this with a look on her face that warned me I was about to feel something I was unprepared for. They had called it Valen's Landing. I asked her when the name had been chosen. She told me they had named it 6 months before they contacted us, before the fleet launched, before the first transmission on that old frequency. 6 months before I heard those 6 words, they had named a world after me and begun preparing it for my people. They had built a future for us before we knew we needed one. The construction was extraordinary. Human engineering teams worked alongside Draven builders, and what emerged from the collaboration was something neither species could have created alone. Human technology provided the infrastructure, the power systems, the water treatment, the agricultural frameworks. Draven aesthetics provided the soul. The buildings that rose from the purple soil were unmistakably ours in form and feeling, built with the same proportions and curves and spatial relationships that our architecture had favored for millennia, but they were stronger, more efficient, more resilient. It was not a colony. It was not a refugee camp. It was a home, being built by 2 sets of hands that fit together, as if they had been shaped for the same work. But the humans did not stay. They set up the infrastructure. They trained our engineers in the new systems. They helped our agronomists plant the first crops, and our architects raise the first public buildings, and our teachers establish the first schools, and our healers open the first clinics. They worked beside us until the foundations were solid, and the systems were humming, and the Draven people were standing on their own feet on their new world. And then they prepared to leave. I asked Lena why. Why build all of this, and then walk away? Why cross the galaxy to save a species, and then not stay to share in what grew from the rescue? She smiled at me, the same real smile she had worn when the star stabilized, and she said something that I have turned over in my mind every day since, and have not yet exhausted the meaning of. She said, "Because you did not stay on Earth either. You gave us what we needed, and you trusted us to become what we would become. You did not attach conditions. You did not demand reports or require gratitude, or monitor our progress, or place observers on our world to make sure we were developing according to your expectations. You gave, and you trusted. We are doing the same." On the last day before the Terran fleet departed, Lena and I stood together on a hillside overlooking the first settlement. Below us, Draven children were playing in the alien grass, their laughter rising on a wind that smelled of minerals and growing things. The sound was the same as it had always been. Children laugh the same everywhere, on any world, under any sky. I asked Lena if I could see the ledger of debts, the actual document. She had mentioned it during our first conversation, and the thought of it had not left me since. A civilization that maintained a formal record of kindness, not power, not advantage, not strategic positioning, kindness. She pulled up the file on a small display device and handed it to me. It was simpler than I expected. A plain document, unformatted, with entries listed in chronological order. Most of them were from the blockade period. Small kindnesses, from individuals of various species who had risked personal consequences to help humans in quiet ways that history would never record. A Valesi merchant who had smuggled educational materials past patrol lines. A Paladri scientist who had transmitted medical data through an encrypted channel. A Cathani pilot who had diverted a supply run to drop emergency rations at a human orbital station that was running out of food. Small acts of decency in an ocean of institutional indifference. The first entry was ours. It read the Draven sovereignty. Stood with Earth when the vote was 412-1. Ran the blockade 43 times. Lost 11 ships. Lost 200 crew. Never stopped. Below that, a single word, followed by another. Debt. Everything. And below that, in what appeared to be a recent addition, written in a different hand, a new line had been added. Repaid. Not because we owed it, because it was right. I stared at those words until they blurred beyond reading. Lena put her hand on my arm, a human gesture of comfort that I had not known I needed until I felt the warmth of it. I asked her one more question. The star chart. The ancient map we had found in the vault of First Songs, showing a route between our world and Earth, carved into stone with tools that predated both our civilizations. Had they studied it? Did they understand what it meant? Lena nodded. Their archaeologists had analyzed the chart extensively. It was over 12,000 years old. It predated both Draven and human recorded history by millennia. Some intelligence that neither species had any record of, had traveled between our worlds in the deep past and left this map behind. Left it in our most sacred vault, buried beneath our oldest songs, as if they knew it would be needed someday. As if they understood that the connection between our peoples was not something to be created, but something to be found. She told me they did not know who had made the chart. They did not know why, but they believed, as I believed, that the bond between the Draven and humanity was not an accident. It was not the product of chance or politics, or the random motion of civilizations through the galaxy. It was something older and more intentional, a thread woven into the fabric of both our histories by hands we might never identify. I asked if that changed anything about what they had done for us. She said it changed everything and nothing. They would have come regardless. The debt was reason enough. The ancient connection only confirmed what they had already known in their bones when they heard our distress call and began building arcs. The fleet departed at sunset. I stood on the hillside and watched the ships climb into the purple sky, one by one, their engines painting trails of light against the deepening dark. The Remembrance went last, its vast form rising with a grace that something so large had no right to possess, and as it cleared the atmosphere, it turned so that its transparent midsection faced the surface one final time. Through the living walls, I could see the gardens inside, green and growing, life carrying life across the distances between stars. Around me, the settlement was settling into the quiet rhythms of a first evening on a new world. 900 million Draven, under new moons, breathing new air. Behind us, across the light years, our homeworld waited. Scarred but alive, healing slowly, under a star that had been given a second chance, by people who had themselves been given a second chance by us. I thought about Kalith Drayan. I thought about her standing at that podium 60 years ago, speaking to an empty hall, calling the blockade murder, while 400 species walked away. She had died 11 years ago, long before any of this happened. She never knew that someone was listening. She never knew that her words, spoken to what she believed was no one, had been heard by everyone who mattered. I thought about Daniel Harding, carrying our sacred artifacts through a collapsing tunnel with a dislocated shoulder, asking about children's artwork before asking about his own injuries. I thought about Claire Dunbar, kneeling to receive a child's trust stone. I thought about Nadia Cole, pressing a water canister into my hands with a grin that said she believed I was tougher than I looked. I thought about the 16 science vessel pilots who had held position around a dying star while it tried to tear them apart, because somewhere in the human heart, there is a place where impossible and necessary mean the same thing. I thought about the ledger of debts, and I thought about what kind of civilization creates a formal government position, ambassador of debts, to ensure that kindness is never forgotten. Not power, not advantage, not the accumulation of leverage or the maintenance of strategic relationships. Kindness. A species that had been abandoned by the galaxy kept a careful record, not of the abandonment, but of the exceptions to it. Not the 412 who voted against them, the one who voted for them. Somewhere in the settlement below me, someone began to sing. I recognized the melody instantly. It was one of the first songs, the oldest in our tradition, the one about the blue silence and the distant garden, and the waters that reflected a single pale moon. The song I had never understood until I saw the star chart in the vault. Other voices joined. Then more. The song spread through the settlement like ripples moving outward across still water, carried from building to building, from family to family, from voice to voice, until the hillside was alive with it. 900 million voices would not have been audible from space, but it felt like they should have been. It felt like a song that big, that old, that full of meaning, that had waited 12,000 years to be understood, should have been heard in every corner of the galaxy. I did not sing. My voice was still ruined from the days of speaking truth to frightened crowds in plazas and courtyards and docks. But I moved my lips to the words, and I felt them vibrate in my chest the way they always had. The way they had vibrated in the chests of my ancestors for 10,000 years. The blue silence, the distant garden, the bond between worlds that no blockade could sever, and no distance could diminish, and no act of cruelty could erase. I looked up at the stars. The human fleet was gone, already beyond visual range, headed back to their 200 worlds at the edge of the galaxy. They would continue building, they would continue growing, and they would continue keeping their ledger, recording every act of kindness, every hand extended in the dark, every voice that spoke when the hall was empty and the powerful had walked away. Because that was what humans did. They remembered. Not the wrongs, not the wounds. Not the 412 species that had voted to let them die. They remembered the one that stood, and they carried that memory across decades and light years, and the vast silence between stars. And when the time came, they turned it into ships and medicine and gardens, and a world named after an old diplomat who had never expected to matter. Standing there on that hillside, on a world that bore my name, under purple skies already beginning to feel like home, I finally understood what we had done 60 years ago, when we defied the Concord, and ran the blockade, and lost 11 ships, and 200 souls, to save a species we had never met. We did not save humanity. We showed humanity what it meant to be the one who stands. And humanity, being what it is, stood back, taller, fiercer, with the kind of loyalty that does not forget, does not diminish, does not calculate the cost before extending a hand. The kind of loyalty that bends the arc of galaxies. I looked up at the stars, and for the first time in my long and weary life, I did not feel small.